So this monumental series of events, this completely earth-shaking series of events, I can tell you it's sort of a universal experience in the US that, like, we haven't had a decent night's sleep in 2021. Here's what occurred to us. All of these events, as monumental as they are, as diverse as they all speak directly to two things. One is they speak to what people think and value personally. It tells us about different people's personal codes of conduct, how they differ from each other, and how important they are to people. And I'm talking about not about political affiliation, but really about personal values and a personal code of conduct. And all these events, we think, also speak to what we all do professionally, which is to train and communicate about leadership and teamwork and compliance and ethics and culture. And we tend to do that based on our organization's code of conduct. So we have this, huge demonstration of the power of the personal code of conduct. We have what we do for a living, which is about the organizational code of conduct. And the question is, does all these events show that those two things don't necessarily mesh up, but to succeed, we need to make them mesh up? And that is sort of the thesis of this webinar.
We've been talking a lot about what happened over the last 10 days, particularly in the US, actually all in the US. But I want to make it clear this isn't about who's at fault or even analysing why it happened, but we want to use these events happening in real time to illustrate how important it is to understand what motivates people to act in a certain way. These events, they provide some really useful learning moments that we can transcribe when speaking to people in our organizations. And I've used the word speak rather than train, although, I guess what Jason and I are interested in doing is training people, but we want to use the word speak because we want to get into the habit of any messaging that we produce to have a conversation with our audience. We want the voice to resonate in our learners' heads. And to do this, we need to get into our learners or our audience's head a little. This is Mark Twain's quote, the famous quote where he said, "You might know the two most important days of your life are when you were born and when you work out why." And when we work out our why, we can work out why we do what we do and what motivates us, and it allows us to be, hopefully super successful, and it helps us show up in the world the way that we want to through our own personal code of conduct, which is, the internal rules, the way that we perform at work and at life generally. And if figuring out our individual why is hard enough and takes time, you can imagine that the task can seem daunting to figure out the whys of the people in our organization. But what we really wanted to do is use the last 10 days to illustrate how we actually can start to get to understand people's whys and how we can target our messaging so that it's so much better. And one of the things I want to say is that when we often look at code of conduct training or any kind of training in-house, we often see that, and training on bullying and harassment or bribery and corruption or whatever it is, we often see you must not do this because the law says X, Y, Z. And that's quite an antiquated way of training. I'm probably going to say, well, I don't see that often, Nicole. But what we then see is, well, we shouldn't do this because it goes against our organizational values. And we want to go one step further and say, we want you to understand that we want you to act in a certain way so that you are congruent with your own values. And I've been doing a lot of work with banks over the last year, following the Royal Commission and the Banking Code of Practice. And one of the biggest things that I've seen is a lot of shame from the employees about the banking industry because they're good people. And the majority of people they work with are good people and they want to go to work and feel good about it. And that's, a massive value for them. I want to turn up to work and I want to feel proud. And really, I want to turn up to work, I want to feel proud. And I want to treat customers the way that I want to be treated because I'm a banking customer. And when I found that I was getting to the root of what they knew or felt was important, I found that the training and the the new behaviors I was asking them to adopt, which were quite onerous, was so much easier to sell.
We're talking about taking these events of the last 10 days and what they tell us about people's personal code of conduct and relating that, using that to pull out learning moments for ourselves, to pull out tips for ourselves about things like when we're planning messaging about whatever that messaging is, what are the key messages we're going to give to our audience? What may be the differences between our audience's personal codes and our organizational codes? And how do we speak to their personal code so they will hear the organization code? How do we, as we said at our first session last year, how do we deliver the message that the audience is ready to hear? This also implicates things like the mindset of collaboration and using collaboration as a way to create that union of the, speak to a personal code and deliver by speaking to the audience's personal code, deliver the audience to our organizational code by being more learner centric. And the sort of mind blown point for us, I guess, in planning this was, wait a minute, so many of these events, yes, there were huge political, geopolitical events, but taking it down to what we all do for a living, they really speak to how we can accomplish those key tasks in making our messages successful, in actually affecting the behavior of our teams. Around with, and to us, sort of the first takeaway is we have to understand what people's personal codes are, and that those personal codes maybe even are likely to be different than the organization's code, that there is a gulf there, and we have to be aware of that gulf in what we do. And I'll give you the example. So we had thousands of people gather for this Trump rally in Washington and walk a mile down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol, push aside beat up policemen, ransack the Capitol, create huge property damage, personal injury, people died. And it could have been much worse. I mean, there were, if you weren't following the news reports the way we were in the States, there were a couple instances of people with bad intent being 30, 40 seconds from taking members of Congress hostage. Who were those people? All right, some of them were anarchists, some of them were out there, right? Some of them were probably just tagging along. Like they went to the rally because it mattered to them, and then they kind of followed the crowd. Those probably weren't the people who actually pushed their way into the Capitol. They were probably the people we saw on shots outside the Capitol. But we know now from the investigations that a lot of the people who ransacked the Capitol, who led the rioters, were police officers themselves, police officers or law enforcement from elsewhere. They were members of organizations who support law enforcement. There were elected officials from other states and cities around the country. There were C-suite executives and CEOs, and one woman who famously, one woman entrepreneur who famously got in her private jet that morning in Texas and flew to Washington for the protest. But here's the thing that occurred to me about all these people. Because of the jobs they had all been through compliance training. Let's take the police officers and the members of government. They had all sat through mandatory employee compliance training. They had seen code of conduct training. They had seen anti-harassment training. They had seen diversity training. They had been delivered all kinds of messages from people like us, particularly people like Nicole and I. It clearly didn't match to their code. Whether they thought that messaging was just about work or whether they thought it didn't really matter, it was just lip service to satisfy some regulator they didn't believe in. However they got there, they had been in their lives inundated at this point by compliance messaging, and nothing about that stopped them from assaulting police officers, stealing things from Congress, ripping stuff off walls, defacing the Capitol of the United States. Let me take this a step further in terms of this gulf. So I saw an interview on TV with a woman who was among the rioters. She was sort of on the front lines, and it was after the fact, and she was complaining to a TV reporter about how she had the police had sprayed pepper spray at her to deter her. And she had pepper spray in her eyes, and she's like, crying, and her eyes are hurting, and she's, they pepper sprayed me. How could they do that? How could they pepper spray me? And the reporter said, well, what were you doing? Why were you at the Capitol? She said, because it's a revolution. Did you think that you weren't going to be repelled having a revolution? Like, how does that add up? That, like, it was police misconduct spraying you with pepper spray when your reason for going into the building was to destroy the democracy. Okay, that's a gulf between her personal code and our organizational code. And we saw the same thing with Congress people who either did stand up and say, we're going to certify this election, even though we may be under some personal danger, even though people tried to supplant us, and other Congress members who had just finished being in fear of their lives, literally running for their lives, and yet came back into the Congress and happily voted to overturn a Democratic election because they were afraid of being tweeted at. Those to me represent the gulf and represent a challenge that we have in speaking to our people. Yes, that was on a large scale, but I think that's something.
Yes, I think it's the interesting thing about that was that it's not just about her saying, I need to do this. This is, part of the revolution. There are two things that happen with that. Number one, she feels that she's part of a movement, and we know that Trump used the word movement. Words
yes,
matter.
He did.
I think movement is a very, very insightful word in this situation. Some situations it's a very healing word, but he used it to incite. That's the first thing. So she felt that she was doing it for a reason. That's number one. And number two, she felt that she had support. She probably felt that she had half the country's support and that it was okay to do.
They use a fundamental technique of making it so that you don't know what the truth is. There's an insidious effect of the what was at first innocently called alternative facts, but the insidious effect is, and this goes back to like Hannah Arendt and philosophers of her like, that when I lose track of what objective truth is, I'm also losing track of what objective right and wrong is. And it sort of falls to what my leader tells me, what my movement tells me. Who am I to know? So who am I going to follow? How can I am not in a position to tell. So jumping ahead a bit, this actually, it's a great point, Peter, because to me, it highlights two other lessons of what happened the last 2 weeks, two other lessons we can apply in our pre-production of leadership and compliance training. One is to understand the power of repetition. One of Trump's major weapons is what marketers call the big lie, right? If whatever it is, if you say it often enough and loud enough and keep saying it and never back off, humans actually come to believe it. They come to believe it, then they come to trust it, then they come to trust the messenger just because it's been repeated. And actually a problem with news coverage is when news coverage starts by saying, here's what the president said. Now, this was false. Okay, yeah, but you had me hear what the president said. He got one more repetition point in. And we know this by looking at the large number of his supporters who continue to believe that the US election this time around was fraudulent, even though reports from other Republican officials and rulings by Trump officials and Trump appointed judges all said, no, there actually wasn't any fraud here. We're looking, we'd love to tell you that there was fraud. Boy, would that make us feel better if there was fraud. Wait, there's no fraud. Guys, there's no fraud. First of all, they use a fundamental technique of making it so that you don't know what the truth is. There's an insidious effect of the what was at first innocently called alternative facts, but the insidious effect is, and this goes back to like Hannah Arendt and philosophers of her like, that when I lose track of what objective truth is, I'm also losing track of what objective right and wrong is. And it sort of falls to what my leader tells me, what my movement tells me. Who am I to know? So who am I going to follow? How can I am not in the position to tell. So jumping ahead a bit, this actually, it's a great point, Peter, because to me, it highlights two other lessons of what happened the last 2 weeks, two other lessons we can apply in our pre-production of leadership and compliance training. One is to understand the power of repetition. One of Trump's major weapons is what marketers call the big lie, right? If whatever it is, if you say it often enough and loud enough and keep saying it and never back off, humans actually come to believe it. They come to believe it, then they come to trust it, then they come to trust the messenger just because it's been repeated. And actually a problem with news coverage is when news coverage starts by saying, here's what the president said. Now, this was false. Okay, yeah, but you had me hear what the president said. He got one more repetition point in. And we know this by looking at the large number of his supporters who continue to believe that the US election this time around was fraudulent, even though reports from other Republican officials and rulings by Trump officials and Trump appointed judges all said, no, there actually wasn't any fraud here. We're looking, we'd love to tell you that there was fraud. Boy, would that make us feel better if there was fraud. Wait, there's no fraud. Guys, there's no fraud. I think even more when it comes to leadership, ethical, compliance type messages, governance type messages. Humans are super good at finding hypocrisy, right? Because that's the out, right? The out is, oh, if you're hypocritical, then I can ignore everything you're saying, right? I don't have to live my life in this difficult way because you're not consistent, and they're super good at it. And Peter, I'm sure you see this, right? So huge challenge on corporate leaders, on CEOs, to do everything they can to avoid that hypocrisy, because one act of hypocrisy and you've blown the whole program you may have been running, because it allows people to just dish it off. And I think that is Stanley, that is a big challenge with with that inconsistency, and I completely agree with you. And also, sort of, where does that language fall? Certainly the people who were storming the Capitol thought they were freedom fighters. I have to say, in my mind, they were more cultists, Peter, because it's difficult to, even if I try and put their head on, like, what exactly did you think was going to happen? Like, what was the mechanism you thought would happen that would actually carry out any change?
So just on that very point, just before we go off, it's actually amazing what happened. That some of them extremely accomplished people, just as accomplished as who's in this room, didn't ask more questions, didn't think about the risks, didn't think about the gravity of the situation. It was almost like they were overcome. And I believe that was because their personal code of conduct was triggered.
I think as we look at it, and I'm speculating here, but I think as we look at it and take it apart, there were groups who were really set on some serious destruction and doing some really bad stuff, and it was lucky they didn't get there. And they had an objective in mind, and they had maps of the Capitol, and they had a plan of attack. But those may be sort of in the anarchists or something like that. But there was also video on January 6th. I don't know if any of you saw it, but there were like early shots of like there's always a camera on. There's always a camera in the Senate chamber and in the chamber of the House of Representatives. And they turn those cameras on, and there are people like just wandering around. It's like they weren't going through desks, they weren't looking for souvenirs, they weren't destroying stuff. It was literally like they got in there and they were like, now what do I do? And they were almost like bored, like, okay, I'm here now. Now what? Now what's happening? So there's so many different things, but at least in the US, this represents, I don't know, 15, 25, 30% of the audience to which we're trying to say, look, when you have a chance to close that sale that your manager's been hounding you to close that sale for the last 6 months and your job's on the line, and that government official asks for you to get them a ticket to the ball game, better not get them a ticket to the ball game. And we're supposed to get that message to sink and to change their behavior.
Particularly when their version of integrity, and I'm going to talk about this, could be feeding my family, looking after my family, having a job, paying school bills, I just wanted to relate that because I've asked a question and I'm going to give you my answer and you can think about yours. You don't have to share it, but you can think about it. What's our own personal conduct? And one of mine, if anyone's worked with me, they will know this, is kindness. I got that from my dad. I shared a post recently. Unfortunately, my dad passed away earlier this year, but he was probably one of the kindest people that I have ever met. And he really passed that on to me about how we treat people. And kindness means different things to different people. And I remember one of my yoga teachers used to say, it's kind if I push you. And, we have to be kind to our bodies and we have to push our bodies so that we can achieve what we need to achieve. And I really agreed with that. And I've tried to do that in my work life. One of the things that really drives me and part of that value is I never want anybody who is in my environment or the environment I've set up to feel inferior because they don't know or understand something. Like that's one of the reasons I love what we do, like training people well, because not everybody understands trade sanctions. And why don't we just break it down? Not everybody understands all the different areas of compliance. God, I lose track, and, Robert, how important it is to break down what's a contract. People don't get taught this at school. And if I could change the education system, I would change it to, at school, the very first thing you learn at 11 is what a contract is, because that will change your life. But it blinds people, and therefore people don't have confidence. They don't return things to shops. They don't complain. They don't do things. And they feel inferior to lawyers who actually, might not actually know a huge amount more, but can probably talk more impressively. And so I just want to just give you an example of what I think is, how to take a value and how to make that personal, because I asked that question, what's your personal code and how does that show up in your life and work? And just wanted to illustrate that so we can bring it back to what we're talking about, which is how can we then, understand how important it is to relate other people's personal codes, and make it okay for them to have that personal code and relate it to the organization values or even the country values.
So here's an experience I had. I guess, Nicole, is a good time to relay this. Experience I had literally in the pre-production process of creating compliance training that at least taught a lesson about the power of collaborating to get this unity of people's personal codes and the organizational code. So in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US, there was a big scandal several years ago in the school system. And teachers and principals were getting into private rooms after school and changing students' answers on standardized tests. So the students would get better scores on standardized tests to meet predetermined incentive goals, basically, for how the schools should improve performance. And it's fascinating what drove the teachers in their personal code to do that, and that would in its own make a good webinar. But I was called in afterwards and the mission was, look, we've decided we have to be teaching compliance and ethics to student teachers. To when future teachers are in college and they're in education programs, they need to be getting compliance and ethics education, and we need e-learning to do that. We don't have room to put it in the curriculum. And basically it was, Jason, would you help us make this training? Really a huge honor to be involved in that assignment. So I sat down with the core group that included administrators and state regulators and state law enforcement and teachers and professors, very different perspectives on education. And I said, okay, well, if we're going to do this, it really should be values-based education. Instead of talking about rules, it's much more powerful to talk about values first. So do you have like a professional code of conduct or some sort of shared values? Are there values that the state has talked about? No. At the time, there was no professional code of conduct for classroom teachers, nationwide or locally. Never been done. It's like, okay, well, this is kind of a challenge. Tell you what, I did workshops with these different groups. And in the workshops, the question I asked was, you all agree that you are professional educators. When you say, what's my job? You say, I am a professional educator. Okay, you put the modifier professional before the descriptor educator. What do you think professional means? Why did you put that there? What does that say to you? And they would throw out words, free associating, and I would write the words on Post-it notes and put them up on the wall, and wound up after these workshops with like 250 words up on the wall. And then in additional workshops, we whittled it down. We put the words into groups, and we sort of came down to eventually to a list of 6 words that we thought encapsulated the training. And I will never forget the experience I had where we sort of came back to the core group and I said, okay, you all heard all the stuff that goes on. I think these here are 6 words. And I expected just, battle royal between these different perspectives on teaching about, no, that's not right. It should be this. And I presented the 6 words and everyone was like, you got it. That's it. Those are our values. It's like, this is amazing. And then we wrote courseware that constantly hit those 6 words. Why do you do X? Because this is your value. This value drives this behavior. By the way, there happens to also be a law that says that. By the way, there also happens to be a state regulation that's along those lines. But we're doing it because those are our values. Here's the interesting thing about teachers, and it actually is like, and we're almost out of time, I'll tell this quickly. It's kind of like what happened with the Trump supporters on January 6th. Teachers have their own code of values, their own code of conduct. And a teacher, typical teacher, the teacher most likely to commit misconduct, research shows, happens to be the teacher who is most committed to the job. And it's because they have a personal ethos, which is my student comes first. And if you present a teacher with a dilemma where it's, I go with what the system tells me to do, or I go with what's best for my student, they will go with their student every time. It's like, student out at night needs a ride home. It's just the teacher and the student. Like, why would you ever want that student in your car by yourself? The teacher puts the student in their car 90% of the time and drives them on their own and leaves themselves exposed to, all kinds of problems because of their personal code of ethic. And we used values to bridge that gap. We said, look, we agree on these values. This is why under those values, which we all share, we act in a certain way. And by the way, the other thing we did quickly, Nicole, was we tried to find a way to use that as value statements to get teachers to stop thinking of those situations in such a binary way. I do what the man says, or I do it my best for my student. It's like, no, just take a breath and work it out, because there's actually usually some other choices in the middle that don't force you to act in such a binary fashion. So we decided we're starting a new tradition on our webinar. We're naming the compliant, here, put on my radio voice, the compliance anthem of the week.
Nice. Is there a countdown?
This week's compliance anthem of the week. Written by
Nice.
Carole King, appearing on the legendary album Tapestry, covered most famously by
Donna Summers?
well, that too. I was thinking James Taylor. You've Got a Friend is our compliance anthem of the week, and we picked that this week for I think two reasons. One is, again, because of that power of community, we need to use that community on our own behalf for the messages we want to share, by sort of professionally, and then Robert and Peter, I think this goes for your roles as well, by having the back of our clients and our audiences, by them knowing, we're with you, we are your friend in the sense of that song. We're here with you. You are not alone. And also because Nicole and I get that feeling of community from those of you who are joining us for this webinar and these webinars, and really make us realize that there is, illustrate that there is a community behind getting these messages right, and promoting a values-based workforce. And we are honored to be a part of it with you.